Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at our second webinar of the series presented by the Research and Evidence Facility, or the REF. As most of you may know, the REF is a consortium led by the School of Oriental and African Studies of University of London and its partners Manchester University and Sahan Research based in Nairobi, and supported by the EU Emergency Trust Fund. Our research examines the context within which migration and displacement related support programs are being implemented in the Horn of Africa, with the aim of providing concrete recommendations to policymakers and practitioners. Some of REF's research work, of course, includes the drivers of migration, dynamics of cross-border economies, government migration management systems, internal displacement, opportunities for resilience, etc. You may, of course, visit our website for further information. In our last webinar, which was our debut webinar in February, we looked at two papers on environmental change and resilience in Kenya. Our presenters were Caitlin Sturridge and Greta Sitlici. We considered evidence on how people were adapting to their shifting circumstances in places such as Laikipia County and Turkana County. And the papers urged a shift in how policymakers and practitioners conceptualize mobility, livelihood, and resilience. So for more information on that webinar in written or recorded form, you may visit our website. Today's webinar considers a different topic related somewhat. It is the information and communication technologies, mobility, and migration in the Horn of Africa. The webinar is based on an extensive literature review commissioned by the REF in 2020, which looks at the types of technologies and platforms used in the Horn of Africa, profile of users, the impact of ICT on mobility and migration, influence of ICT on livelihoods and everyday mobility, and policy and programming efforts vis-a-vis ICT and mobility in the Horn of Africa. The report was authored by Peter Chonka and Yiknekachew Haile. And so I would like to present our speakers for today. Yiknekachew Haile, who will be starting off, or Yidu, is currently a doctoral researcher at the Royal Holloway University of London. His current research focuses on the interaction between ICT and mobility migration and development in the context of the Global South. He has a background in ICT for development, research, and practice, including development, deployment, and training of software and hardware ICT solutions. Our second speaker will be Pete Chonka. He's a lecturer in global digital cultures at King's College London in the Department of Digital Humanities. His research focuses on the impact of new media technologies on culture, politics, conflict dynamics, mobility, and humanitarian communication in the Horn of Africa. He has previously worked as a Somali interpreter for the International Committee of the Red Cross and has also taught at the University of Hargeisa. Our discussant today is Daniel Mwesigwa, who is an ICT policy analyst and researcher at CIPESA, Collaboration on International ICT Policy in East and South Africa. Southern Africa, apologies, which is an ICT policy and research organization headquartered in Kampala. His work at CIPESA focuses on Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Daniel has published in several journals and is a fervent commentator on technology issues regarding internet governance, mobility, startups, and digital entrepreneurship in Sub-Saharan Africa. He is also an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where he's exploring the implications of artificial intelligence on the Global South. So thank you to our speakers and discussants. You're welcome. Just a couple of webinar rules. Each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes for their presentation. And after the speakers and the discussants, we will open the floor for discussion. We, of course, encourage you to please type your comments and questions in the chat box, which we will take after the presentations are terminated. Thank you. Yidu, you are on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Padmini, and thank you very much for all coming. My name is Yiknekachew, as introduced, and you can call me Yidu for this purpose if you find Yiknekachew difficult. So as we all know that the ubiquitous ICTs or digital technologies are not only just changing the way we live and we work, but the overall socio economic dynamic in multifaceted ways, including mobility and migration. So in this session, I and Pete will touch on this role and impact of ICTs or digital technologies on socioeconomic in the mobility and migration, and how as it relates to the broader socioeconomic dynamics. I will start with looking at the broader landscape of ICTs with a particular focus in Africa and primarily in Horn of Africa, but generally the global South. Pete will link that to how that access and use of ICTs will relate to mobility and migration, and as it relates to the Horn of Africa. I will start with two major indicators which we are actually using mostly as indicators of signs of good ICT development, which is mobile phone penetration and use and internet penetration and use. So I will start with that. So as we all know that these technologies are distributed unequally globally, and that inequality is actually paramount in when we see with respect to the Horn of Africa. So mobile phone subscription, for example, in the Horn of Africa is 51 per 100 people when we compare to the global 100 subscription per 106 people. That is, a person has more, I mean, from the people who are already using mobile phone, the number of subscription is more than the number of people in the global lanes, whereas it's only 51 when we see it in the Horn of Africa's context. And even it's lower than the sub-Saharan average, which is 82 per 100 people. So mainly this technology, when we see mobile, is mainly limited to basic phones. Smartphones are slowly coming in, which are mostly low cost, low featured smartphones are joining in, but we don't know how these are changing at the moment. We have very limited data on the effect of these low-cost smartphones, particularly. In one hand, for example, availability sometimes, such as this low featured or low cost mobile phones, is not actually the actual problem, but the actual use is a problem. For example, in Kakuma camp, in one of the research that we have cited, 45% of refugees in the camp have access to actually a fairly good smartphone, but they are struggling to charge those phones and to access a reliable data or to afford for a data. Those are more complicated problems than having the device itself. So in this case, for example, the national, according to those research, the national average for Kenyan population is 26, but those who have smartphones in the refugee camp is the percentage is about 44, which much higher than the national average. Now, access to mobile phone and its connectivity is very much limited to mostly 3G networks, 2G, 3G, 4G networks, but mostly 3G networks. So Wi-Fi and other connectivities are very limited. And inter-regional divide is also very much prevalent. As you can see from this slide, if we see the difference between Kenya and Eritrea, and the divide is very, the gap is very large. That has, different factors to bring it to play. Kenya, Uganda, and Somalia are, have some sort of, established good digital policies coming up. And for example, some innovations like mobile money, M-Pesa in Kenya, and when we see Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan are actually sort of trying to catch up all these services, whereas in Eritrea, for example, there is no sign of development at all. In the Ethiopian context, we can see, for example, there are some changes in relation to the recent change with the political reform in the country. For example, there is, a start, at least a motive or a process that we have been told, and we have been witnessing that global international IT providers are invited to, to share the state monopoly in the telecom sector, which has been for years monopoly by the state, which might bring some sort of change. But it doesn't mean that monopoly is always facilitating the use and access of digital technologies, that we have seen in the case of Djibouti, where while it might be a specific case due to the size of the population, the number of people living in that geographic area, or the density of the population might be a factor. But while it's a monopoly, it is one of the top, even in higher than the global average, both internet and mobile penetration. So the problem we have here is that the data we are having is mostly from international organizations like from the World Bank, ITU, but which are mostly based on subscriptions. As we all know, subscription will not tell us accurate story, and a person may have more than one subscription, or a single subscription may be used by multiple users. So on the other hand, subscription doesn't mean use or impact. So these are some of the areas we see as a gap where specific context-specific research is needed to tell the actual story. As Pete may touch it later in his speech in relation to Somalia. For example, the penetration in the Somalia shows it's very low, but the evidence on the ground seems that there is much use of internet and mobile phone that might relate to difficulty of accessing data because of the situation of the country, the stability and the security of the country. When we see internet, so Africa's penetration at the moment, Africa's percentage of access at the moment is 22%. Not at the moment, actually you have a data until 2017 or 2018, which is really low compared to the global average. However, things are changing. It has been only 2% in 2005. So you might say it's a very good change. And we all know that the number of users, the number of global internet users in Africa is the third in the world, next to Asia and Europe. But still the penetration is very low compared to 80% of the global average, which is in Africa, it's around 40%. However, the rate is, fastly increasing. For example, some research we have cited shows that the rate of broadband, internet broadband subscription is 3 times more than the faster than the global average. So that might change the dynamics in the near future, in addition to other opportunities like latecomer advantage, where latecomers can adopt new technologies without going through all the in the process of adopting all technologies. When we see specifically in the Horn of Africa, that it is only 20% compared to the 50% global average when we see the internet penetration, I mean. However, inter-regional divide is also, very paramount. As I said in earlier, for example, Djibouti has, a higher penetration, both internet and mobile, and even more than the global average, whereas in countries like Eritrea and Sudan and Somalia are particularly low. The reasons might be based on our experience and our reviews. It seems that political factors are playing a great role. For example, we can connect that to the Eritrean situation or the South Sudan situation. So the South Sudan situation, for example, mainly related to infrastructure and conflict. In Ethiopian situation, as I said, also things are changing recently. That might be related to state monopoly and authoritarianism kind of control, where all internet use and mobile phone has been controlled by the government, and that's mostly linked to security issues. But we have seen actually a significant change in the past 2-3 years. For some of the research we have cited, for example, indicated how the main ICT infrastructures has been used for a political purpose rather than the purpose they have been built for, such as education and health. So when we see the digital inequality in detail, so as I said, it's multidimensional and multifaceted. It's related to the broader social, economic, geographic, and demographic factors. So we have also highlighted that the difference between digital inequality and digital divide, as previous research has been focusing on digital divide, where they are actually talking more about the provision of equipments and infrastructures, which doesn't imply that the use and impact of the digital technologies. So also the research shows that the digital inequality is, related strongly with other socioeconomic factors, as we say, age, gender. For example, the young and the educated who have access for finance have a better access and the skill to use these digital technologies and to benefit from them, such as by utilizing their weak social ties from a distance, for example, for work purpose, for education. So that's more prevalent in the case of women when we see with other socioeconomic factors, socio-cultural mostly, socio-cultural, also economic factors, where women have limited time to access internet, more responsibility due to domestic responsibilities, and access to finance by mostly the male household heads. These have contributed significantly for women's digital exclusion from that area. But we have also seen from the literature review that when we have access, we are able to address these inequalities. Digital technologies can benefit more the most marginalized people, like women, as we mentioned, or people in the rural area, or people, the elderly people. So I was intending to touch a bit on policy, but because my time is coming to an end, possibly Daniel can touch on that. And also I was trying to say something on the humanitarian programming, but Pete can connect it too, or we can come back to it in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yadu. Peter, you can go ahead with your screen. Thanks.
Thanks, Yadu. Thanks, Padmini. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. Just starting the slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks a lot. Yadu's given a really useful overview of some kind of broader ICT dynamics in the region. And as he's mentioned, I mean, our literature review on the question of the relationship between ICTs and mobilities was was very general. We looked at kind of the greater Horn of Africa and the wider literature research that's available across, multiple different countries, the ones kind of listed in the chart in Yidu's presentation. We also looked at a much wider range of literature from other kind of global South contexts that may be relevant to the picture and the questions we were addressing in the Horn of Africa. However, for my short amount of time to present today, I want to kind of zoom in on the Somali context, because this is the context where I do most of my research, some of which we talk about in the literature review itself, because I want to kind of ground this into some everyday realities for some of the most vulnerable people, some of the most vulnerable mobile people in a context like Somalia. And here I'm referring in particular to the experience of internally displaced people. And the images that are in the background here all came from a previous research project that I was involved in, looking at the relationship between displacement caused by conflict and ecological shocks and urbanization in different Somali cities. And we used a photo voice method where we equipped displaced people in camps to take photos of their daily experiences. So all of the pictures in this presentation, apart from the very last slide, have been taken by displaced people. Now, that particular project didn't focus on mobile phones as such, but in the course of that research, the sort of the role of the mobile phone, the basic mobile phone, became kind of absolutely central. We could see it as being absolutely central to people's kind of mobile lives, their experiences of negotiating travel, movement from countryside to urban areas, often to kind of settle in sort of sprawling makeshift camps around the edges of Somali cities. And so the mobile phone was kind of central to kind of camp life and the mobility experiences of these people. I mean, the image here shows you what a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Baidoa in south central Somalia looks like. And this gives you the sign here. The displaced persons camp, includes the mobile phone numbers that people would call in order to kind of make contact with the kinds of what we would refer to in the research as kind of humanitarian entrepreneurs or gatekeepers in sort of INGO parlance, who manage these kind of camps. And throughout the region we see increasing penetration of particularly basic mobile phones as kind of, as connecting people in their kind of multi-directional movements between rural areas, often affected by ecological shocks, conflict in the Somali context in particular, and cities, and their moves back and forth between these places and kind of their livelihoods related mobilities. This image shows children in a displaced people's camp, well, actually a resettlement area on the edge of Bosaso in Puntland, playing with counterfeit hard currency. And this slide kind of is illustrative of the fact that in so many Somali contexts, cash money, physical cash money, is becoming increasingly kind of irrelevant. In some places, it's almost out of circulation, and mobile money, even for some of the poorest, most vulnerable, marginalized, displaced populations, is becoming increasingly prevalent. And these people, displaced people in general on the edge of Somali cities, make a huge contribution to processes of urban reconstruction. They do labor in cities, and so often their wages, the money that they negotiate, is paid through mobile money systems. And also, as many of you participating in this call will know, humanitarian organizations are increasingly kind of using digital-based and mobile money-based systems to engage with such mobile populations in context of internal displacement. That's something that's widely known. I think what is less widely known, and and something that again sort of came out through some of the research that I was doing and some of the things that we talk about in the literature review, are issues around digital literacy and the fact that so many people, vulnerable people, are using these technologies to access aid, to access wages and salaries, and yet and in many ways they're kind of compelled to use these systems, right? Because this is what the humanitarian organizations are offering, and therefore, you know, you need to be given the SIM card, you need to use this in order to get, you know, humanitarian payments when they're available, in order to be paid for casual labor, etc. And the quote in the slide here from one of our interviewees, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but it kind of recounts this story of a woman doing work in a city dweller's home and then being promised payment for this work, doing laundry, and then being denied this payment or given a reduced payment after the work had been done, because the employer could say, well, I'll pay you by mobile money. I'll use EVC, this was in Mogadishu, and I can pay you remotely through mobile money technologies, which, as we know, are ubiquitous in somewhere like Somalia, also Kenya as well, certainly, and elsewhere in the region. And what was interesting about this is that it kind of speaks to a kind of a different narrative of ICTs and empowerment, which is the kind of the traditional narrative, right? ICTs for entrepreneurial opportunities, people can do business. And this particular example showed the way in which ICT use and the kind of the remote nature of payment could actually feed into kind of existing social inequalities between displaced people and locals. And that's a side of the story that's not really told. And a lot of this kind of related to vulnerabilities that these people had in actually using the interfaces. And so she talks in this quote about how she has to ask the man in the shop, the shopkeeper, to help her access her information and access her balance in her account and transfer the money. And so this kind of highlights a range of vulnerabilities that I don't think are necessarily being discussed. There's very limited literature on this, and relate directly to how particularly mobile populations and vulnerable mobile populations experience these kind of technologies. And I'm happy to speak about that a bit more in the Q&A. Just a couple of points before I wrap up. So our literature review kind of addresses the kind of question of the relationship between ICT use and mobility. And a kind of natural question that people often ask is, well, does increased access to ICTs increase mobility, right? Can we draw a link between increased use and access to these technologies and people moving? And the short answer on the basis of our literature review is no, we don't have the evidence to demonstrate that, because this is actually a really complicated question that involves the interrelationship of multiple different factors. So ICT use doesn't cause increased migration, and the reason we can't draw this causal relationship is because we can look at kind of wider processes of economic growth and the ways in which economic growth can drive increased mobility, increased rural to urban migration internally. Economic growth in the literature is often kind of associated with increased outward migration, which is sometimes counterintuitive to how we sometimes often think about these things. Economic growth, economic change also kind of increases the prevalence of ICTs. Access to, you know, these devices become more available. If people are moving more, and if people are moving back and forth between cities and the countryside, then they tend to take devices with them. So mobility in itself can increase ICT use and access as people circulate devices and move. And then when more people have access to devices, they have access to various types of information that in itself can connect rural areas and rural livelihoods and urban areas, and potentially increase mobility. Although it can also decrease mobility, because if people are able to communicate remotely, then in some cases that removes particular needs to move. So it's a really complicated question, and it's impossible to kind of draw out kind of a simple kind of causal picture between the increase of access to these technologies and mobility. I mean, what I would say is that kind of the increase, particularly of internet penetration through mobile data and smartphones, does allow for the growth and the increased kind of importance of transnational social networks. And some other research that I've been involved in, this time with the Rift Valley Institute, on a different kind of profile of young people's, more affluent young people in cities like Hargeisa in Somaliland, and the ways in which young people who do have access to smartphones, who do have access to social media, are connected into all kinds of different forms of transnational content, which has quite a profound impact, I would argue, on how people understand life in the diaspora and think about, you know, aspirations for mobility and potentially opportunities and networks to look for migration opportunities through. Often the literature on ICTs and international mobility focuses again on kind of how empowering this is, that like it kind of facilitates people to move. Some of the things that I've been increasingly interested in and have increasingly come across in the course of my research are some of the many risks that are involved in particularly young people's engagement with these transnational networks, their vulnerability to particular types of scams that promise certain opportunities for mobility, some of which are really sophisticated. I mean, the image on the left, top left-hand side of the screen here is one such image of a scam, which I identified through contact with and some of the research that I was doing with young people. This research involved young people sharing screenshots of their social media use with me and us discussing these. And so some of these kind of risks, I think, I mean, there's very little research on this. We don't know what kind of resources are being extracted from people through these types of mobility scams around migration opportunities, educational opportunities. And I think it's an important area of research, which again kind of filters into this discussion about wider kind of patterns of digital literacy. So all of these kind of dynamics, I'm looking forward to discuss more in the Q&A session coming up. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks again, Yidu. This is a very expansive review, and you have really covered some of the salient features in your presentations, and hopefully we'll get a chance to bring up some of the other issues that may come up organically. I would like to invite Daniel to please share his screen. So Daniel is our discussant today. I will give the floor to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Padmini. Thank you very much, Yidu and Peter. First of all, congratulations upon such an incredible piece of literature review. I had such an immense pleasure looking at it and reviewing it and reflecting upon it. Once again, I'm Daniel Mwesigwa. I work with CIPESA, which is an ICT and policy organization based in Kampala, with a regional footprint in about 14 African countries. So a lot of the work we've been doing is at the intersection of ICTs and society in sub-Saharan Africa. Very well. So most of my intervention is going to be as a provocation to what has been discussed already on the floor. Now, as we know, ICTs have captured popular imagination, in specific, the mobile device. The mobile device has been very successful in framing this narrative because it's a multi-use device. Unlike fertilizers or seeds, which are single-use, mobile devices can be used for an array of things, including communication, including commerce, and even transactions. So in the instance of mobility, mobile devices have greatly facilitated remittances, which are not only internal, but always and usually international. And for the last 3 to 2 decades, remittances have been the backbone for very many poor households in sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of what has been discussed is framed mostly from the Horn of Africa, but I strongly believe East Africa should indeed be a greater Horn of Africa. And most of the conversations have already problematized the infrastructure leap, which is often viewed as homogeneous. So most of the discourses on infrastructure view infrastructure from the supply side. How do we close the access gap without rather looking at some of the multifaceted and other multi-dimension issues that are engendered in inequality, in digital inequalities, as Yido has really talked about. So infrastructure is beyond just what you can look at connecting one person to another, but rather has other different sets of issues, including cultural, including social, including technological, and others. So this is where my provocation comes in. A lot of the debates on infrastructure only view the gaps in terms of the digital divide. However, most of the lack of internet connectivity in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa is largely unrelated to infrastructure. Because in any case, over 80% of geographical landscapes are covered by network. So think of 2G, 3G, or even 4G, which is growing steadily according to the GSMA, at least forecasted to at least 30% by 2025. So the 46%, which is the so-called access gap, reflects or is well captured in the literature review. Things like skills gap, things like income, things like deficits in education are some of the reasons that are accounting for the lack of connectivity. But also primarily, infrastructure shouldn't only be looked at from the supply side. Regardless of the first landing of the fiber optic cable at the coast of East Africa in 2009, and regardless of the cost having been significantly driven down from about $1,000 per kilobyte of data to now about $7 to 1 Mbps, there have been lack of last mile access. And this is very well in line with some of the deficits that have been discussed in terms of digital inequalities. And this is why it's very important not only to look at infrastructure from the supply side, but also look at it from the demand side. What is happening in areas that have been marginalized and underserved by large telecommunication companies and other organizations. Now, I want to give you an example, and possibly to bring it to home. Infrastructure is not just only the copper wires and the fiber optic cables. But towards the reframing of the concept of infrastructure, I would like us to use the example of mobile money agents. If you look at the visualization, you will see that population spread mobile money agents are centered towards areas that are either at urbanized areas or that at border areas that are renowned for historically renowned for trading and commerce. And I would like to borrow a very nice concept from one of my favorite academics called Cleperton Mavhunga. Mavhunga frames mobility, specifically technologies of mobility, in three ways. First, as mobile technologies, something that we can see as devices and the like, but also mobilities of technology. How have the narratives been framed in terms of technology transfer from the global north and from the south? Does it only frame Africans or sub-Saharan Africans or East Africans in particular as only consumers or users or as designers? But then also, Cleperton looks at a concept called technologies of mobility, which is different from mobility of technology in a way that these include various other actors, including people, including the devices, including even inanimate things like animals and natural calamities. So the reason why I'm sharing this or framing the concept of infrastructure is to show that infrastructure is not just a set or the standards of tools and codes and processes, but rather also includes social, cultural, and other political factors that are historically relevant in a way that people have been navigating spaces based on proximity, based on historical relations, and based on their interests, the need to make a profit or even survive. And as you well know, African youth, or basically Africa, is a very young continent. In Uganda, for example, the median age is about 19 years, although some recent reports show that median age is 15 years. And once we reframe infrastructure in terms of people in this way, it enables us to see how people are extending themselves across time and space through ICTs and specifically mobile technologies. So you would imagine that in one way, people are actually, taking on various roles. In one instance, someone is a mobile money agent. In the evening, they are riding a boda or a motorcycle. Then early on in the morning, they're possibly tending to the garden. So this multiplicity of roles transcends across very many borders in East Africa, but then also is a reimagination of how multifaceted or how complex people use ICTs, not only for, as has been critiqued in the literature review, to show that ICTs have this magic or this leapfrogging effect from one place of the GDP to another, but rather how people are using this in their everyday lives. And of course, it's very important because it includes in the concept of surveillance in this regard. Again, borrowing from Cleperton Mavunga, we shouldn't view things or in terms of the North and the South, or what happens in the global North or what happens in the South, but rather this is an invitation to have a look at how have East Africans, for example, reimagined the use of these technologies. Part of the examples is during the rollout of M-Pesa in 2005, when it was being tested out by the UK Development Agency. It was initially set out to be a microfinance product, but yet people had been trading airtime credits or airtime currencies amongst themselves previously, started kind of gaming the system, until when it was actually seen that people actually preferred a remittance platform. But the youth have been very central in this way, because they are not only trying to find ways that work for them, but they are also trying to find things that are optimum through the use of technologies. Now, how can we know that ICTs have been important or have been relevant, especially at the micro side of the economy? It's important to follow the money. So the next couple of slides are from Brighter Bridges. I would encourage you to have a look at their reports and their ecosystem maps. So in the last year, this is a very recent report published in January this year, shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been at least $2.5 billion US attracted in the market, and most of the funding is dominated amongst 5 countries, including Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, and Egypt. And most of the funding has grown, and we can segment it in different areas, but predominantly it has been alongside sectors that have financial technological aspects, basically movement of money from one place to another. But then also there's been massive support for very many African youth, especially in different countries. And specifically in East Africa, Kenya has stood out as one of the regions, or as one of the countries that leading in the region. But this provokes thought. Despite of this massive investment that have grown in the last couple of years, but also massive investment in support infrastructure, how come that the youth, specifically the Africans or East Africans, are not at the forefront of the innovations? A report published in 2017 by Village Capital, which is one of the leading accelerator companies in the world, showed that 80% of all funding in Kenya, for example, went to white founders. What are some of the implications, or what does this mean for some of the initiatives that are being pushed or supported for the African youth? Does this mean that they're over-mentored and underfunded, or is it a case of observing some of the trends and how they're panning out? Well, We can't talk of the youth without looking at the role of government, because most of the
2 minute warning, Daniel. Sorry, 2 minutes.
Because of the initiatives, or because of the engagements previously have been private sector led and also led by multilateral organizations. Government still has a role to play, and some of the necessities or the requirements that we have seen in the last maybe 10 to 15 years show that there has been an evolution toward digital government, and this evolution is nicely or tightly coupled with investments in infrastructure. For example, in Uganda and in Tanzania, there are national backbone infrastructures that governments are using for service provision to the last mile. But is this rhetoric or is this reality? In Uganda specifically, the Access for the Information Law was passed in 2005. However, public access to information is still something that is yet to be fully recognized. In the interest of time, maybe I can talk about some of the technological demands and technological requirements by multilateral agencies and donors that have led or that have brought about the turn to biometrics, or the imaginations towards the management of mobility, or even the management of how people cross borders. And this poses unique challenges and unique threats, not only to the mobilities, I mean, irrespective of the fact that increased connectivity brings about possibilities of digital or remote work. These technological demands and these technological requirements are new challenges that must be thought about today. And I mean, in a nutshell, I believe, and I'm greatly enthused by what Pete and Yidu have been able to accomplish, because these are various issues concerning ICTs. And as we very well know, ICTs touch or transcend different sectors of the economy, or different sectors of society. So indeed, it is hard to actually find direct causal linkages between ICTs and say growth, because of how, you know, different directions of causality could be going, or even different factors, statistical factors, the so-called endogeneity problems. However, this is a call, or maybe this is the need to actually investigate deeper and have richer ethnographic studies that show how ICTs are affecting mobility and other sectors and other aspects of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks again to Peter and Yidu. We'd like to open the floor for questions. And I know that there's one question already in the chat about human trafficking and ICTs. And I know, Peter and Yidu, you talk about it in the paper. If you'd like to give an intervention on this topic, please go ahead.
Sure. I can start if that's all right with you. You do. Yes. So it's a good question. So there's a fairly large body of literature out there that talks about the so-called, you know, European refugee crisis around 2015, and you know, movements of people across the Mediterranean, and a lot of that literature touches on this question of the relationship between ICT, social media, and human trafficking economies and practices. It's a complicated question, because some of this literature, as we cover in the review, would argue that the more connected people are to mobile phones and social media, the more likely they are to the more they have these connections as they are moving, particularly through Mediterranean routes, the more they are able to avoid the most dangerous, the most exploitative, extractive smuggling networks, because they have access to other sources of information and connections, also kind of informal networks, but ones that are somewhat less violent or exploitative. So there's that argument is made, and there's some evidence to back that up. You know, because the people who are migrating, you know, from regions like the Horn of Africa through the Mediterranean, those who do not have access to that technology are generally likely to be the most vulnerable migrants in those contexts. However, at the same time, we do know that you know, human trafficking networks, people smugglers, you know, use the same mobile networks that, you know, that other kind of networks of migrants use to facilitate mobility. So people are certainly kind of sucked into those relationships through the mobile phone, through the use of social media. What from my perspective, what's kind of interesting about this is that this research, the very large body of research focused around the, you know, the so-called refugee crisis, looks at migrants in the Mediterranean zone or migrants after they've arrived in Europe. There is much less research on the ICT use of prospective migrants within the Horn of Africa itself. So people who are thinking about migrating, and what kind of access to information do they have? To what extent does access to ICTs kind of put them into contact with human smugglers? We know much less about that. There are some great studies out there. Nimo Ali's work on migrants, you know, the motivations for migrants and the profile of young migrants going on tahrib, irregular migration from places like Somaliland is really valuable here. And anecdotally, we see social media playing a role there. Just finally, one thing that came up in the context of my research with displaced people in Somali cities was the way in which ICTs enabled some of the kind of extortion from human smugglers who were holding family members in places like Libya, right? So migrants, so Somali migrants made it to places like Libya, being kidnapped, being detained, being tortured, being ill-treated, and then images, videos being kind of sent back to Somalia, people making phone calls to, you know, tell family members that your family member is here, you need to send money, and then the use of digital remittance networks to be able to send those money to, you know, to sustain this, you know, hugely violent and extractive economy. That entire relationship depends on ICT connectivity, right? Because you can't extort people unless you're in contact with them and able to kind of share this content. And there is some research, again, that we talk about in the literature review that shows how that's happening in other contexts, and we've come across it in Somalia as well.
Thank you so much. Yidu or Daniel, if you would like to add anything to that?
Just to add a point, the point that has been raised, this use of technology during trafficking or smuggling or generally in the mobility, that shows actually, you know, the double-edged, you know, sword nature of technology in general. So in the literatures, in the publications that we have cited, you know, there are evidence that technologies has been used for digital torturing and people being tortured in front of a camera, especially in the Mediterranean, in the Libya, refugees from Somalia, Eritrea, and from Ethiopia, and where smugglers use mobile phones and video calls to torture them in front of a camera so that they can ask ransom from distant relatives from Europe, United States, or Australia, or from home. So this is one. On the other hand, as Pete articulated it, so it has a very significant and visible enabling power when people are in the move. As we all know that in the so-called 2015-2016 refugee crisis, migrants have been really had a different voice than before when they are connected with the global population using their mobile devices. They have a platform to put their own narratives on and against border regimes and mainstream media to represent themselves, what they are and why they are migrating, what happened in their journey, instead of just being active participant or active listeners of what is being said. So generally, yes, we can say technology has, both, advantage and disadvantage, but how we can utilize it for a better for all, and particularly for the marginality, which will remain to be a big question.
Thanks so much, Yudu. So we'll just jump to the next question, I think, from Alas Ibrahim. He asks about the role of ICTs for IDP communities and displacement, internal displacement, and ICT use. We'll start there. And then, of course, we have a question on the link between the rise of ICTs and inclusive cash transfers by humanitarian development agencies. What advantages and disadvantages does this shift bring for displaced people? So maybe we could begin with the IDP question and then go on to the cash transfer question.
Yeah, I could say something about that, and I think these two questions are very closely linked, given the fact that it's often displaced people who are the supposed beneficiaries of the increase in cash transfers. So I mean the conventional narrative, which I'm not disputing, goes that digital cash transfers by humanitarian organizations to displaced populations are appropriate in many of the contexts where they're being undertaken, where there are already kind of existing mobile money systems in place, and where there's a fairly high level of at least basic mobile phone penetration, right? And of course, the cash transfers through M-Pesa or ZAD or EVC or whatever systems being used don't necessarily need internet connections and smartphones, etc. So the arguments here are that this is convenient. It can be sort of remotely managed from a distance. That this is more secure for beneficiaries because people are carrying accounts on PIN protected mobile phones. They're not carrying cash around with them. Arguably this is better for female recipients of aid because it's about having more autonomy to use cash aid, to access microfinance. And these are all I think very valid points. And in the context of my research, and again I'm going to speak primarily about the Somali context, people spoke kind of favorably about getting cash assistance. The complaints were always these payments are not regular. We got a payment once like a year ago or 2 years ago, and that hasn't been sustained, etc., etc. I mean, there's a few issues that are raised by this. Firstly, the assumption that that cash transfers, e.g., to displaced people in camps, are more protected from sort of the diversion of funds to camp gatekeepers is not really realistic. In our research on sort of camp economies, gatekeepers, the kinds of people who organize these camps, are still able to access, and people have obligations to pay, and they will pay, through mobile money systems themselves and transfer portions of aid. And often people don't necessarily have a problem with that. They sort of see it as the payment that they have to make to be in a certain camp. So the assumption that this kind of automatically reduces the diversion of aid, in many cases, in my experience, is not necessarily valid. Another issue here relates to the security of the data. So the cooperation of telecommunications companies, who are some of the most powerful commercial actors in a context like Somalia, alongside major international humanitarian organizations and local implementing partners, is generating huge amounts of data about vulnerable populations. And there are increasing conversations going on at the moment, and initiatives by people in the field to kind of look at what data data is being generated about some of these vulnerable communities and some of the risks of this for those people in terms of data security and how that data is used and shared. And there's in the Somali context, there's very limited oversight. I mean, there's no data protection laws, etc. So that's an increasing issue, and we're going to see much more discussion about that. And I really would encourage, people to think closely about the role of telecommunications companies. I mean, companies like Hormuz in Somalia are the biggest economic players in the economy. I mean, in terms of their role in the banking sector, the remittance sector, investments in commercial agriculture. I mean, Hormuz provides firefighting services in Mogadishu, right? Their whole corporate social responsibility is an important thing. And we really don't know much about how these companies operate, and they are deeply embedded with the kind of cash transfer economy, and that's something that we really need more research on.
Thanks very much. Daniel, or Yidu, if you have any intervention.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I think Pete actually kind of sets a very solid way of looking at it. But specifically responding to Caitlin's question, the rise of ICTs and increase in cash transfers is also very context driven. And most of the research, for example, done specifically empirical kind of randomized control trials show the efficacy of cash transfers in different humanitarian conditions. However, from a micro kind of standpoint, I'm just echoing what Pete just talked about. This increased financialization of the poor, or the financialization of the displaced, actually exposes them to very precarious conditions of different economic or finance systems, which are mostly known for their discomforts more than their comforts. And indeed, telecommunications companies, not only in Somalia, but across sub-Saharan Africa, are so important and so powerful that a lot of this data that they are collecting, irrespective of the existing legal regimes. I mean, Uganda has been renowned for passing these progressive laws. However, when it comes to the practical or to the implementation side of it, it's a totally different story. So in many cases, we might talk about the absence of, say, data protection laws or the absence of consumer protection laws. However, most of these telecommunications companies and their partners are operating in the dark. And also speaking about, like, back to the biometrics point, and specifically mandatory SIM card registration exercises that were prompted by the increases in crime, have not produced any substantive evidence of their efficacy. So, for example, with increased demands and requirements from different donors and multilateral partners, there's been the need to connect different databases. So not only connect the SIM card registration database, but also the national ID database, or connect it to the new facial recognition databases. And this widens a complex architecture of surveillance that also doubles as a digital architecture of social protection, to which the operation is still, is in the dark. And irrespective of, some of the laws and the progressive oversight mechanisms, the story is absolutely different. And again, I think this is why it demands for deeper research and deeper studies that that basically take these constituent parts apart and kind of critique and analyze them beyond what the variables are saying that cash transfers ABC bring about this percentage change X1. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think we only have about 8 minutes, so I just want to get to the last question here that's asked by Anne. What are the most effective or impactful ways of improving or enhancing the adoption of ICT literacy, mainly to bridge digital divides among marginalized people? The floor is open, so we have about 5 to 7 minutes. Whoever wants to respond to this.
I kind of make a point. As you might be aware that we don't have much material informing this part of the question, and this question is also very much context based. But I can give some answer based on my personal experience. When I was in Ethiopia, I used to work in like training, people how to use digital technologies, and that was my living for a while until I was interrupted by the point I mentioned, that the very much authoritarian kind of, which is 10 years ago, and now there's some change. So based on that experience, what I could say is, I think the most effective way of doing this is linking to the existing local social institutions. So in the context of, for example, in Ethiopia, that might work better when we use these facilities and infrastructures, for example, in schools, embedding them into school curricula, for example, and using social institutions where people gather for different purposes, and people build different social institutions locally. So embedding that into the technology and integrating to their day-to-day life and showing them how benefit might work in a way that people can easily relate, what they are getting from digital skills, rather than being very much hypothetical. That's just a point from my experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Peter or Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, I totally agree with what you just said about these questions being very context specific. Again, in the context that I've done most of my research, the issues that we've identified in this research in terms of vulnerable populations' use of marginalized people's use of technologies often kind of can be traced back to very basic questions around basic literacy and basic numeracy. So the example that I was talking about in my slide, populations of people, so particularly working women, particularly older people, and again, I'm talking about urban displaced communities in Somali cities, who need to use these technologies and who are using these technologies. They are connected, they do have basic phones, they do have mobile money accounts, but they don't necessarily have a full understanding of how to use them, right? They rely on other people to kind of check their balances, to transfer money, and that opens up all sorts of kind of vulnerabilities. So there's potential, for kind of outreach there in terms of basic numeracy and literacy skills that are focused specifically on the use of basic ICTs for what we might call kind of financial inclusion stuff. And I think there's a role to be played there by the telecom companies like I was talking about before. And I honestly don't know what's going on. Like I've looked and I've tried to kind of identify those kind of basic digital literacy type campaigns, but I haven't been able to kind of identify them. That doesn't mean they're not there, it's just that I haven't come across them. But I think there's potential engagement with these big telecom companies who do provide information about their services and do outreach to people, but often in formats that's not necessarily the most suitable. So if you want to learn how to use these technologies, you go onto their website and download a written in Somali written kind of explanations of this, of how to use this stuff. But what about kind of resources? What about outreach that's targeted at people? Because people don't have a choice whether to use them or not, and these are huge vulnerabilities. I mean, there are much bigger kind of questions about people's understanding of personal data, how that gets used, and like kind of wider kind of questions about online risk. But that's a different kind of conversation, and that's something that needs to be worked into kind of educational curricula, etc. But I think the sort of basic literacy, numeracy stuff, there's scope there for really potentially valuable programming involving the telecom companies, I would argue.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Paradoxical as it may sound, I think some studies have showed that democratizing access could be very, very much important. So basically democratizing access from the telcos and taking it to the communities through community and cooperative networks. And some of the evidence from South Africa and Mexico is showing that actually whenever people have such access that is nearly free of charge and with more accessible or more affordable devices, there could be more need, even if it's just communicating from one place to another, or enabling information flows to actually, to flow easily, could be very much important. So democratizing access and liberating it from profit-driven imperatives that are often centered by traditional telecommunication companies, and also big tech companies such as Google and Facebook, which are, by the way, laying some of the longest fiber optic cables that's going to connect sub-Saharan Africa, are often not driven by philanthropic needs or philanthropic requirements, but they are long-term profit projections. And that's why, for example, Google is very happy to kill off projects that have been testing out and running for a couple of years in East Africa. For example, the Project Loon, which was recently killed. So in summary, democratizing access and taking it back to communities through more flexible licenses and spectrum innovation and stuff like that. I mean, we shouldn't be talking about this technical stuff, but some of the evidence that has already been has already been indicative that it can actually be done, especially in communities that have high needs of communication, especially also in rural and underserved areas.
Thank you so much. That was all astute observations. And of course, I feel that we have just scratched the surface of the literature review. I mean, we didn't, unfortunately, get to the aspect of gender too deeply. It's an all-male panel. I was really hoping that we would get there, but we're short on time. But we'd like to invite everybody in the audience to refer to the report for some very interesting insights also on the mixed picture around ICT use and gender and longstanding structural issues. And I'd like to thank Peter, Yidu, and Daniel for your intervention. A recording of this webinar will be available on the REF website alongside the paper and the smaller research brief. I realized that I never introduced myself at the beginning, but my name is Tadmini Ayer. I am the Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the Research and Evidence Facility. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in April on technical and vocational education and training, another interesting topic. So do look out for announcements on that. Thank you again for joining us, and wishing you a good evening, afternoon, wherever you find yourself.